Well, I guess the great place to start here is who's going to do the interview, because you wanted to interview me, and I'm sure you have some questions we need to get out of the way. But I also wanted to ask a few things about what you're doing and perspective on Switzerland. I guess first to introduce you, it's Tom Watson, and you're with Innovation by Design, but you wear a few hats, and we'll get into all of that. And why don't you tell us what you're doing here in Zurich this week?
Yeah, so we're working for the New Zealand innovation agency called Callahan, and we're looking at some different case study cities, of which Zurich is our first one. We're stopping it. And we are looking at how innovation startups happen here, creativity, design, art, and talking to a number of different people to understand what is the special sauce in Zurich, what is the Swiss flavor, and what can we then learn about how we might create an innovation district in Wellington or just outside Wellington in an old industrial area.
Cool. Sounds exciting. And you're not based in New Zealand at the moment. You're based in San Francisco?
Yeah, that's where I'm based. San Francisco and London. So I grew up in London. My parents are there. So while I'm in Europe, I'm based in London. But I went to the design school at Stanford in San Francisco, and I've remained there. So I've been in the States about 11, 12 years now.
Great. Feeling a bit more of a native, I guess, by now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But you're still traveling around a lot. And you worked for the World Economic Forum for a couple of years, right?
I did their fellowship program, which is where I met Brian in New York.
Right. Brian Stone, a former colleague of mine from Credit Suisse and now at KPMG in Switzerland here. Cool. So what have you been seeing in your travels around the world looking at different innovation hubs?
Yeah, so this is the first
First stop.
Yeah.
Oh, great. What an honor. You went to the world's most innovative country first.
Well, I think that, those are exactly some of the questions I want to ask you, because you've been here quite a bit of time, haven't you?
Yeah. So 8 years now for me. To tell my story quickly, I'm from Toronto, Canada, grew up very comfortably in downtown with a lot of things going on, especially in the financial services industry, reasonably innovative country. And I always felt very comfortable, but wanted a more international life. So I took the opportunity to go do an MBA. Was lucky enough to get into Oxford, and time flies, that was 8 years ago. And then ever since then, I've been here in Zurich. And it started off as, I would say, a more traditional banking career. I came having a background in wealth and asset management and came to work for Credit Suisse. And what I realized really quickly, and why I really wanted to come here, was I had this strong belief in the fundamentals of Switzerland, of the importance of wealth management and how it connects the owners of business with different topics. So you're dealing with family, with business interests, with financial interests. It's kind of an interesting place for things to mix. And at the time, we were just coming out of the financial crisis. So that was one thing. And everybody was thinking, is finance still the place to be? Maybe this whole technology place is better, startup life. But then the other thing that was going on in particular with Switzerland was the end of banking secrecy. The value proposition, which had really become the world famous success story here, and had led to actually quite a lot of, I think, the wrong type of innovation. How do you get around rules? How do you avoid customs agents? Things like that. And so most people weren't thinking of coming here, but for me, it was this combination of change with strong fundamentals that made it so interesting. And what I figured out really quickly was that we were reacting to the change, not really seeing the opportunity that this, what we now call the digital economy, was playing. That led me into first some innovation topics in the bank, and then helping to set up some FinTech engagements, even a co-working space that we worked with. And ultimately, what I realized was a lot of companies were in the same type of zone. And really what you could see was things were shifting from being all about what was going on inside the company to how do you react with what's going on outside the bigger world, and how do you connect in these digital economies. That was when I left the firm. I had a little bit of a history starting the FinTech Association, which we can talk more about later. But I started my own company, perhaps a bit similar to yours, called Elliott Capital. And we work all around this idea of how do you leverage ecosystems at different stages of the company life cycle.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's why Brian put us in touch, because of you sort of had a startup in Zurich.
Yep.
And for me, that's a really interesting data point to understand. So what?
Definitely.
What you were here already, so it wasn't attracting you to Zurich, but what was helpful in the Zurich innovation scene, and the structures that were in place to help you create that company?
Yeah, so I think first of all, it was still a lot of the same reasons that professionals come here and companies and individuals choose Switzerland. It has a great set of fundamental attributes. The other thing is that through the Swiss Finance and Technology Association that we run, we connect all the time with international startups. And the question I guess get asked by everybody is, why Switzerland? And I think it really is a list of, you can look at them in different perspectives, but a list of really strong fundamentals around creating a strong business climate. And there isn't really tons of change being done all the time. It's a set of fundamental principles about freedom, about a certain amount of transparency, about rule of law. And those are really things that make Switzerland a great place throughout the last 100 years. So, things we often hear are taxes, to be quite honest. Taxes are low. Another major thing is the regulatory environment. There's a general light touch type of regulation. You might be familiar with the concept of self-regulatory organizations. So a lot of things in Switzerland form as a community of experts and then establish principles, and they're monitored in a more of a light touch approach. FINMA, for example, is much leaner and much more focused on specific tasks than other regulators around the world. And what you see throughout this is this traditional Swiss pragmatic type of approach. We don't want to waste money. We don't want all these bells and whistles. We want to do things that prove that they have value and they need to be done well. I think what we're now really starting to see beyond the regulation is also that companies are forming around these communities. So you've heard of perhaps the crypto valley around cryptocurrencies. So what we're seeing is, global companies and global entrepreneurs looking at Switzerland sort of like a platform and saying, what characteristics does this really work well for? And these blockchain and crypto companies are a great example of the type of firms that see those strong fundamentals as attractive.
Really interesting. Thank you. I think I also don't really know enough about your FinTech startup. Maybe you could tell me a couple of things about that. I want to also balance that. Sorry.
No sweat. So do you mean, so I wear two hats, just to clarify. So there's the Swiss Finance and Technology Association, and then actually through the experience of that, and then a couple of years later, I started my own company, Elliott Capital. It actually runs all the community building, the events, the content creation, the things that we do to build the ecosystem for the FinTech community.
Okay.
But it also does that for other companies throughout their life cycle. So what we mean by that is from an early stage when you're planning a company up to actually launching it and then growing it. And then at the end of the life cycle, when you're a big company, how do you stay fresh? How do you stay connected to things? And the core of it is really around, once you've got a company started, or once you've got a good idea, how do you get it to be successful? How do you connect it with real clients? How do you raise how do you raise capital for them? And that's what the company Elliott Capital does.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Really important for these crypto companies that are coming here, wanting to set up. You hold their hand if they're coming internationally, and is that sort of?
Well, to distinguish, the association does much more of the hand-holding, and especially the non-commercial early stage stuff, because a lot of this stuff isn't viable, and that's why you see that the community isn't always well supported. And actually, that's perhaps one of the drawbacks about Switzerland. You don't necessarily have the same sort of, it's not necessarily a drawback, it's a double-sided coin. Take London or Singapore, for example. The governments are very proactive about spending money to foster their economy. And as a result, you see they have very well-funded initiatives around whether it's an innovation hub, location, things like that. Not to say Switzerland doesn't do that, but there's a far more prevalent wait and see approach. And when they do spend money, it's not in the same sort of a way. It's small amounts. It's on very specific aims. It's not pumping and trying to promote something like that. So that's where the association becomes really helpful, because there's a group of people in the community, whether it's successful entrepreneurs, companies that see the benefit of having a vibrant coral reef around their hunting grounds. There's a bunch of people who see the benefit of fostering that, and the association is a way of answering early questions, connecting people with mentors before they've launched their startup, doing all those kinds of things that having a community of peers really works well for.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you a couple?
Yeah, go for it.
So
this is fun.
Makes
it easy for me.
Lifestyle and living. And this is a really interesting block that you've just given me a little bit of introduction to. You've got 25 floors, there's 3 towers, pretty unusual in Zurich.
Yep.
You started living here, you're working here.
Yep.
There's a number of companies that have moved here, and there's going to be a co-working space. And this really talks to some of the questions I have about sort of the lifestyle and your average day and sort of quality of life. That's one of the things that we've heard is the quality of life in Zurich.
Yeah, and I totally skipped that over. Thinking from a business perspective with the why Switzerland question, I think for personal reasons, people love Switzerland. It's a great place to live. The work-life balance is really well respected. It's not quite the same as France, but it's 9 to 5 or 7 to 3 or 4. All kinds of flexible but very focused hours of work. You're not going to be harassed all night long and over the weekend. The exception to that is maybe a startup where you get a lot of pressure, and there is a bit of a different dynamic to the typical Swiss lifestyle. But the great thing is if you look just outside here, we're 5 minutes from the river, you'll see people on a sunny day jumping into the dam and floating by in boats and inflatables. You've got a world-class, one of the best airports in the world, 15 minutes from here, and you can get to anywhere. You're in the center of Europe, great healthcare, interesting people from all around the world, great international kind of cultural scene here in Switzerland. So loads of things that make lifestyle really very comfortable here for people.
And can you sort of talk about some sort of words that for you represent that lifestyle in Switzerland?
High quality, I would say balanced. Yeah, those are two of the main ones. Healthy, I would say as well. Very healthy lifestyle. Organic has been a big trend around the world for, say, the last 10 years. Organic was something that was always very, very much appreciated here in Switzerland. Actually, it's almost most of the products are available in bio. You have car sharing is another thing that the sharing economy took on early here. You have this very holistic mindset that really focuses on quality of life, not just how much you can make as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you have any questions? Should we swap over?
Well, one of the questions I was going to say is how does the design thinking background and the design school sort of heritage play into what you're doing? I think you also spent some time looking at how cities come together. Is that a part of the project that you're working on?
Absolutely. We want to understand whether cities have, in their innovation parks and zones, if they've used design thinking and need finding to understand sort of those key needs that founders, innovators have and what are those requirements.
Yep.
It's a tool that we used in a lot of our work, and so here we're actually trying to understand how much design research has been done and sort of ideas around fit for purpose.
Yep. Are there any kind of schools of thought on how do you, or actually maybe put this a different way. One of the words I use a lot is the whole idea of ecosystem. People use different words. Startup communities is Brad Feld's famous kind of term for this. Are there any kind of schools of thought or designs when it comes to building these types of communities that you're looking at?
In terms of what are the levers for success of these communities?
Yeah, or some of the success stories from around the world that you think are particularly interesting.
I think back to making sure you have a rounded international multidisciplinary group is really important.
Mm-hmm.
And how you can create a space or zone that caters to all those different needs, yet builds this sort of gravity that allows those people to interact and have those serendipitous meetings, conversations.
Right. There's a book I love, and I'm going to forget the author's name. I think it's called The Innovation Rainforest, but they're from Silicon Valley, and they have this really simple analogy that I always stick to, which is when you're building kind of an innovation ecosystem, do you want to build a jungle or a rainforest rather, or do you want to build a farm? And I think sometimes what we've seen here in Switzerland and what we're trying to offer an alternative to is people like predictability. They like to know that things aren't going to change too much, and they like to know that they're going to get the result. And that looks a lot more like a farm. You've laid out your land, you've lined up your rows, you've planted your seed, and you know how much you're going to spend to grow that. And there's a lot of programs like accelerators and other things which look great at first, but then you realize they're creating these more rigid types of frameworks. And taking this rainforest type of analogy, what I've always really found interesting is how do you use these sort of platforms or other types of models of engagement where you can create more freedom, more opportunity for unusual things. And to be quite honest, you don't have to do it all yourself. You don't have to invest all this money in controlling things. It sustainably fosters its own exciting output as well.
Yeah, so I think with what we've seen at the moment, we sort of see three groups.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the rainforest, or the sort of organic growth that's happened because, you know, people have come and set something up themselves. You have the sort of government-directed park that is quite prescriptive.
Uh-huh.
And then you might also have a sort of business-led park, which is, you know, based on a business startup fund that's trying to attract entrepreneurs or spin out startups from their business. And I think that that still stands, where you're saying you have the sort of more directed, but it can be directed by a government, or it can be directed by a business.
Yeah. Of course, it's always a balance between a bit of structure, and you have to do something to foster this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Here's one thing that comes to mind is I've noticed you're going to a couple of cities around the world. A lot of people used to say we need to be like Silicon Valley. Do you think that's valid? Do you think everybody needs to be like Silicon Valley, or are there other maybe influences or thoughts to consider when you start out in that type of questioning?
Yeah, no, I don't think we all need to be like Silicon Valley. I think Silicon Valley is a wonderful place. I live there, and I appreciate it for what it is. It is quite tech-centered. So some people have said it tends to be more of a monoculture with the sort of power of the tech companies. And so let's embrace what Zurich has and Switzerland has, and think about how to, yes, create spaces that allow creativity and alignment in life, but let's not just sort of replicate Silicon Valley.
One of those three models you mentioned a moment ago was sort of a fund or a business type of an incubator, let's call it, model. What have you been looking at, or what are some of the factors you're interested in around financing? Do you see that as an important part of these startup communities?
Absolutely, yeah. That's one of the reasons I was excited to talk to you, because I haven't found too many people to talk to me about the financing side.
Here in Switzerland?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
I've spoken to a banker at UBS, but it's kind of different from those sort of smaller venture capital funds that there's a lot of in the Valley.
Yeah, well, if you need a couple more contacts before you go, I can think of a few. Switzerland, every country is different, right? Switzerland is in many ways really strong for raising financing for startups. There's lots and lots of money here. There's institutional investors, asset managers putting money out around the world. There are investors in hedge funds, private equity, everything else. You have great big pension funds. Everybody here has a nice, well-funded pension. Those asset managers help manage it. And then as well, something that's really unique for Switzerland is you have this vibrant family office community. And actually maybe a fourth one is business angels, and actually business angels who come directly from the financial services industry. So for FinTech, that's actually really nice. The big dynamic, though, that I think is interesting about fundraising in Switzerland is a few years ago, 5 or so years ago when we got started, people talked a lot about early stage funding, and that's because it was a new area and there wasn't a lot of money flowing into it yet. What happened in the last couple of years was a lot of those business angels, and especially people from the finance industry, said, hey, I'm free of the politics. I'm interested in staying fresh, and this looks like something that's got potential. So those business angel groups have now really done a good job of funding, and we see a swelling amount of fintech companies around Switzerland. The next part's a bit trickier. The growth funding stage, when you're past your sort of Series A and you need to start growing and becoming a serious company that's going to be successful, what you have is a couple of VCs here, and there's some really good ones. Red Alpine sticks out. They're an investor in a lot of the DACH region and have been very successful. There's others like Lakestar that were early investors in Facebook and have done a lot of big deals around the world. You even have Index Ventures in Geneva. But the nature of Switzerland as a marketplace is that it's a very small market. So if you're starting a venture here, there's a limited number of cases that are going to be a success story within Switzerland, and they're probably going to be more like base hits or, solid success stories, but not the Silicon Valley unicorns. And so what you see is if you're going to be a growth story and you're looking for more serious venture capital, you can't really look to do it in Switzerland. That's changing a bit. You've had a lot of corporate venture capital, like I think about $200 or $300 million set up in the last 2 or 3 years. Helsana, a few of the insurance companies as well are all into this stuff. So now there's money, but really you have to go back to what's the startups market. And if it's going to be Switzerland, it doesn't need the kind of big venture capital that is going to justify that type of a community. And so what you still hear about now is this idea of a funding gap. When you're at that stage, you need to be thinking of Germany, the UK, the US, Asia, somewhere where there's a real market and bigger growth investors. And then once you've proven successful on that kind of a global scale, or an international scale, you can come back and start to work with the institutional investors like UBS and Credit Suisse and all of the money that stands behind them.
I hear there's a Swiss innovation fund that's taking shape.
Yeah, the details of that are always sort of evolving. It used to be called, I think, the Entrepreneurs Fund. There's a gentleman, Christian Wenger, who I believe is really active and supportive in that, also of Digital Switzerland and other Kickstart and other initiatives over the years. So if you haven't had a chance to meet him, somebody who's really important in the startup community here. They also have a thing through what used to be called the Commission for Technology and Innovation. It's now called InnoSwiss. And InnoSwiss has not only funding programs, but in the past it had fostered something. It was called CTI Invest. I think it might be called Swiss Startup Invest now. But they do a lot of activity on a national level for startups in general. And that's a great example of how these things work.
Does that work in your opinion?
I haven't seen the statistics on it. And being a CFA, I'd love to see the actual numbers and give it a real opinion. I think it achieves a broader goal of fostering the startup community, of creating that type of activity that they want to do. And yeah, there's definitely some big success stories, especially in like medtech, ICT, other areas that Switzerland has some strong competency in.
And so for your startup, you started about 3 years ago,
Yep.
Elite Capital. And can you give me an example of a client where you sort of took them through this exciting journey?
Yeah, so still in a building phase and in the community aspect of what we do. So some of the things are a bit stop and start. We've done a number of like business plans, things like that. The first case was actually probably the most interesting. It was a serial entrepreneur looking to start a new company and recognized that doing it the traditional way of just going out and finding co-founders and building it on his own was, let's say, inefficient. So he engaged me to help work with the network and then with the capabilities to help him build the company. And it was what's called a hedge fund reinsurance incubator. So yeah, a very sophisticated international type of a business. And it's
to do with, sorry, just
Yeah.
jumping in. When you talk about reinsurance,
Go ahead.
At the moment I'm thinking about a lot of these sort of catastrophe bonds and
Oh, yeah.
new financial instruments to hedge climate change.
I know you only have so much time, so I won't get into the whole learnings of reinsurance. But it's a fascinating industry, and I think to bring it back to something everybody knows about is Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett's thought of as just an investment guy and maybe a bit of a hedge fund manager, but the largest part of his success is attributed to the fact that he owns owns insurance companies and reinsurance companies. I think he's somewhere in the top 5 of the largest reinsurers in the world, along with companies like Swiss Re here. And if you look at the types of companies that I was helping to incubate and start, they were actually by the top hedge fund managers in, say, New York or London or wherever they may be. But they didn't really want to get into the reinsurance business. They didn't understand it in the same way Buffett did. So we helped them find things that they actually were already basically covering out of their pocket, like cyber risk, which is another whole interesting aspect of how the insurance industry is changing. We would help them look at that as an opportunity to start using something they were familiar with, which is tax-deferred compound interest. Put some money aside, invest it into a reinsurance type of a policy, and you can cover these things in a more efficient way over time. And it was a very sophisticated thing. It works really well if you have all the resources in place, and it doesn't really follow the traditional startup type of a life cycle. It's not two guys with an idea who are meeting in college and working in their garage for years before they get venture capital. It was much more institutional, much more build it and launch it. And that's the sort of stuff we really work well with, is whether it's a first-time entrepreneur who needs the support and the network to speed them up and make them more successful, a serial entrepreneur who recognizes there's things that they'd rather, let's say, outsource or partner to get more efficiently, or I think you mentioned it before, corporate ventures and spin-outs. That was actually a big part of the start of this for me, was when I was in the FinTech position at Credit Suisse. I was doing a lot of work to figure out how are we going to connect to the outside world. But there was this flip issue that I was getting contacted by all these people inside the bank who were stuck in their cage. They were getting a bit of help to test something, but as soon as it was proven successful and something outside of their core focus, it was being shut down and they were getting in trouble. And
These were potential startups.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And actually what happened in almost every single case was it didn't go well internally. They ended up quitting. They've met somebody through the bank network and got funded really quickly. And now they're out there doing something a few years later in the FinTech world. So
a lost opportunity for Swiss.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Swiss.
Yeah. Byproduct, you would call it in a lot of other industries. But I think, yeah, you kind of look at the more open architecture of innovation now. And I used to refer to it a bit like an airport. You need the ability to have things come in and land. You need to suck up the innovation, but you also need to figure out, okay, stuff's happening here, which might not fit inside the company. How do we benefit from seeing that go somewhere else?
I was having an interesting conversation with a Korean politician about their sort of startup scene and the power of the chaebols, which are these huge conglomerates.
Kind of cartels almost, right?
Let's call them conglomerates.
Yeah.
And they squash innovation by buying up any startup that could be perceived as sort of competition, or not to say they always want to squash it, but
right.
It's back to your airport analogy, is sort of a big block on that runway for startups. And I think some maybe in the Valley as well, the power of the tech companies as well can inhibit some of these startups in maybe the vein that the founder had them grown.
Yeah, I guess one of the things I ask myself over the years here is, because Switzerland is more of like a risk-controlled or risk-managed culture, because people expect, you can't live here without making an income. It's a very expensive place to be. Whether there's some sort of a middle ground between, the pure disruptor type of a model where you have to run out and figure out how to get money and take down these big companies, and something that's a bit more collaborative where, there's funding for these types of programs. People with ideas can test them out. When there is value to be gained, you can realize that, and more of a win-win for the entrepreneur community here that's less, let's say, cutthroat than the American capitalist system.
I like that idea, yeah. The Swiss government provide a lot of really important foundational parts of the puzzle, like regular, efficient, not too expensive transport, and back to sort of rule of law, all these main sort of foundations that you need for society. They seem to do very, very well. And the transport in the Bay is
no good.
Pretty bad.
Even with Uber?
Uber's helped people who can afford to get from A to B, but it's increased the traffic in San Francisco quite a lot. So and air pollution. So there's ups and upsides, downsides.
And then there's the company buses and all the other innovations. Oh, and the scooters.
Yeah, they got banned after a while.
Oh, are they?
They were people were just piling them up on the sidewalks.
Well, they don't have that many here, but what there's a bike underpass under the station here, and every 10 minutes it's flooded with people and kids walking with their mothers and everything. And there's a bike lane next to it. And people are good enough now that they can get through without problems, but the bikes go pretty quick, and people will park their bird or their scooter right there in the middle of the bike lane. And I think they do it for the Instagram photo, what a jerk they are, and get a few laughs and likes and move on in the world. Wow. Yeah. Anyway. But no, the transport's another great part of the lifestyle here. Lots of nice things that we can do.
Light type regulation or co-created regulation. I guess that's very important in a new industry like crypto.
Yeah, we didn't talk much about that, but there are two bits of regulation that were really, I think, impactful and interesting for international companies. There's what's called the distributed ledger technology regulation. I think Switzerland, just in general, has been one of the leading countries at figuring out how is it going to be a home for these types of companies. And it's specific, but it's not changing a lot. It's very helpful in that way. And then the other one is the FinTech license. And I won't go into all the nuances of it, but basically what Switzerland has is sort of these three buckets where if you don't fall under the regulations, which a lot of FinTech companies can figure out how to do, they don't need any kind of a license. If you are doing things that are a lot like what a bank would do, whether you're transferring money and need to think about AML, or you need to identify your customer or worry about capital requirements if you're holding money. There's a FinTech license, which is basically like a light banking license, and it has lower levels and a few other requirements. And then there's this sort of 10 million franc starting point Swiss banking license. And the interesting thing there is you see companies that are going across the stream. There's some crypto companies that are actually now registering for banking licenses. They've raised enough funds, they've maybe gone through an ICO, and they say, we want to be able to do the sort of things that we can do with a full-blown Swiss banking license. So it's interesting to see how that's really helping to give structure, and it doesn't have to be all kinds of rules and a game with 50 million different things in the rule book. What they do is it's a bit like soccer. Let's make a nice field, really simple rules, and watch the beauty of the game as it unfolds.
Mm-hmm. And you've been at the center of that, watching, supporting these companies set up. Fascinating place to be. You've really seen this area take off. You've been a part of helping it grow. What are the learnings from that?
So I'm really biased, and we're here doing an interview to help kind of connect the community and foster this whole ecosystem idea. For me, the core of what we really do is that community building. And a bit of a quick history of Zurich was about 10, 15 years ago, there was very little of the sort of startup. It's a bit like Silicon Valley, right? There was Hewlett-Packard and these early stories of lone entrepreneurs, huge amounts of money, high startup costs. And then you had venture capitals with their portfolios of entrepreneurs they supported. Then you had these sort of Y Combinator types of accelerate. You've had an evolution. Here in Switzerland, it basically came out of a lot of the hard science that the technical universities have. And that's one of the other great features of the country. Some of the best universities in the world are here. Albert Einstein went to school in Switzerland. The history of a place just down the road from here, Technopark, that was really the first startup location in, I think, even Switzerland, but certainly here in Zurich, it was a key early stage one. And if you go in there, it's great. It's like a beehive filled with companies, but they're pretty hard science. There's drones and sensors and all kinds of things that come out of the technical university. And about 5-7 years ago, there was a company called Impact Hub, which now has a couple locations, of course, all around the world, but also has been really important in Switzerland. And I think what they really got right was they focused on how do we connect, this tribe of people, these sort of social entrepreneurs and lifestyle entrepreneurs who are really dynamic, and, the cafe crowd. And if you go by their location now called CoLab, you'll see it has a really vibrant cafe that brings in not just entrepreneurs, but the community. People bring their kids there on the weekend, sit with their dogs. It connects to a refugee center next door, all kinds of different things happening in the community. And I think they really showed the light in terms of the importance of not just building a space and saying, hey, this is for startups, but how do you foster that connectivity and those opportunities within the community?
Yeah, I spoke with them yesterday, and they said, first thing, create the community, then the building.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't know what the history was there, but their old location was a lot about just hosting things and getting stuff done. And then the more space for offices came, 5 years later, which was great. And actually, the cool thing now is you saw when I was at Credit Suisse, I was involved in helping getting them the support to make that happen. I think Swisscom and Six were the other two big supporters. And what's great is it helped make it happen, and you could see that really become a permanent part in the startup community. But then you could see that it wasn't fit for everything. So now there's a lot of people who would prefer, let's say, a more professional setting, not like exposed bricks and casual clothes, but offices like Google and Suits. So there's been a couple co-working spaces now that are working in more of that vein. And then what we do is really more focused specifically on a community around FinTech. There's others around prop tech, legal tech, med tech. So yeah, that community is key.
Have you used any of these spaces? Or have you?
Yeah, so we're based for the last 3 years, I think, from Impact Hub. We do a lot of our events there, have our meetings there, host all of our stuff there. We've also been to Technopark over the years. There's one down the street here, which is also quite good, called West Hive. Office Lab. There's tons of them around Zurich now. Yeah. But you notice the difference. The ones that don't have the community like Impact Hub does, they have a completely different atmosphere. It's, we're here for the lowest price, a mixed bag of some companies. The office facilities are very ragged. I think it's hard to compare when you get that, lifeblood of the community, right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's back to the sort of the magnetism that we were talking about.
Yeah, that's my favorite term. Center of gravity, magnetism, that whole kind of effect is you want to be engaging in the community in a way that creates relevance and it's genuine and it attracts people into the activities.
Creates relevance. And then it can be self-fulfilling. So with the crypto scene here, there's a critical mass, there's gravity, and you mentioned after you sort of get to your first stage of funding, you might then go to Berlin or London to...
Right.
Would that be sort of moving the whole company over, or what have you seen are the ways in which companies sort of grow?
Usually they would have an office or something like that. Usually it's part of an expansion plan. So Squiro was a good example of a company from Switzerland that's done that. They've gotten international investors. They opened up a sales office in London. That became a big part of the focus of the company. So it's a bit like, say, a watch company. It's Swiss quality selling and craftsmanship behind the idea, and then growth into these markets. One of the catches there, and there's a few companies that exhibit this, Selma and Wealth Management, also WealthArc, they're international entrepreneurs at least international entrepreneurs or Swiss people who moved back to Switzerland. And then they have a lot of their back office in other locations, whether it's Finland or Poland or Austria. A lot of the successful companies that are going to figure out how to get over the hurdles here realize that they have to have these more international teams to make it work.
Can we talk about art?
Art, yeah. Love to.
How does that fit into all of this? Because I think that's from our perspective, art making a very important part of a creative ecosystem.
Personally, what I've realized over my entrepreneurial journey is it's a creative process. And so many of the things you learn very early on as an artist, like not caring so much about results, caring more about the process and what you're creating, are really actually very true about the entrepreneurial life and all of this. So I think the other side of it is art is just inspiring and it makes you think. So instead of just thinking about your own tasks and the problem at hand, being around art or being around that type of influence is really enriching and helps balance out what you're doing as an entrepreneur, as an innovator.
Yeah, inspiring, really important word, really important, I think, part of the valley and the sort of natural beauty we have there. And Switzerland's got a lot of natural beauty as well. You mentioned people swimming in the rivers, the lake, obviously, and then you've got these Alps that are a playground for the winter and the summer. Yeah,
great opera house, world-class art institutions, Art Basel. So if you like, it's kind of like our Burning Man, much more sophisticated, but all the creative types from around the world are here. What else have you seen around the subject?
Yeah, no, I think inspiration is a really important part of it. And so when I'm tying it back to New Zealand and Wellington, I think there's a number of similarities there with Zurich and the really beautiful nature and being in nature. And you do have that feeling when you're here in Zurich, the place I'm staying. I'm 2 minutes away from cows.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're never far from something beautiful. Even the kind of rough parts are nice. The graffiti here is great.
Yeah, I appreciate that as well. And so this idea of inspiration, and you can see it, and with the natural beauty, you can feel it with some of the art forms that are here. What else would you say inspires people here in Zurich or Switzerland?
Well, I think we haven't talked about it yet, but what I would call the social or sustainable side of entrepreneurship and FinTech in particular is something that's quite interesting. Switzerland is such a wealthy, successful place. Everything is perfect. You can really get stuck in a bubble. And I think a lot of people here and a lot of organizations here are engaged in other parts of the world which aren't at the same sort of level of Switzerland. And whether it's simply to share knowledge or right down to being on the ground with philanthropic organizations and NGOs, there's a really close connection to those types of different parts of the world here in Switzerland. And you see there's a really strong part of the FinTech community here that started up. The UN has just created an organization called the Sustainable Digital Finance Association, which is based here in Zurich. And I think we get a lot of inspiration from realizing that this is a very special place and we need to look outside of the world in terms of what problems we could solve there.
spent a bit of time at the Art Dock, which is down by the railway.
The Art Dock? No,
Yeah,
what's
so
that?
there's 2 remaining railway goods yards that have been saved, and it's quasi closed at the moment, but they've got these beautiful exhibitions of Zurich and Swiss artists,
Oh, cool.
run by an 80-year-old architect called Ralph Benziger.
Wow, I'm going to have to go look that.
Yeah, you need
this
to look
weekend.
it up. And he worked on actually the Swiss railway timetable change for the Rail Vision 2000.
Okay.
And he's now got these.
That sounds like a risky or a big project here in Switzerland.
Yeah, it really was. And he's also been involved with sort of a market and different ideas for the city. So very, very much involved in the fabric and creating this art space, which I've been very inspired to sort of visit and see the community there as well. And the sort of intergenerational mixing that he brings there, you know, being in his 80s.
Yeah. Great architecture in Switzerland, great art community. And the interesting thing is there's a bit of a fringe community here in Switzerland. There's not quite anarchists, but there's definitely sort of more of an artist community, less of a established kind of mainstream voice. And you see it in these art exhibitions, the underground sort of stuff that's around the city. But yeah, that's really cool. Oh, there was a point I wanted to say, but it's just flown out of my head. Oh, well. Oh, the last point on art, actually, that was it. One of the interesting connections to the whole idea of finance is the idea of value. And we're actually hosting an event. It's not one of our traditional sort of FinTech focused ones that we do through the association. It's one of these more exclusive ones I do through my company, LA Capital. And we're looking at an artist called JSG Boggs. And he passed away a couple of years ago. But he is probably one of the more famous, he's called a counterfeiter, but he basically did art that was replicating what looks like money. And he would then go spend it and basically force people into this really awkward, you know, out of the norm conversation about, well, no, I can't take that. It's not real money, but don't you see it's this beautiful piece of art and you'd be able to get probably more if you look me up on the internet. And yeah, it's this interesting question of what do we value? How do we create the systems that we use to transfer value in the system? And yeah, a bit more related to finance in this case, but the idea is again to inspire people and make them think differently, right?
It's a lovely prompt. I really like that for your community to be talking about that. And
well, we haven't done anything like it, so the whole idea is let's inspire a bit, right?
And it's in some ways an inverse of the cryptocurrency, which is
bang on, exactly. Well, that's how we frame it is, you know, with all the focus on virtual money, you know, let's take a look at somebody who asked the question, what is value? How do we build these systems? What do we all believe? Pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. So where else are you going to be stopping while you're here? You're only here for another day, right? Not even.
Yeah, just today is the last one. So I'm going to go and talk to a designer, Sonia Bishel, who does storytelling.
Okay.
At the collab.
Great.
Yeah, which should be good. I'm going to go to a Deco now to go and talk to them because human capital is a big part of
definitely
sort of need for startups, and Switzerland has some, as you mentioned, very good universities and you know, incredibly talented people.
Yep.
But also can be expensive.
Exactly.
So that's another part of this story.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and it's kind of the dynamic where we get involved. A lot of people who are working in finance, and whether the industry is declining or people want different styles of work now, they're interested in stuff like FinTech. And yeah, if you're leaving a bank salary where you're making 150, 200,000 francs a year, in some cases even more, the startup world doesn't work on those types of numbers. And even if you take those numbers down in Switzerland and you're paying people, you know, 5,000 francs a month or something, 60,000 francs a year, it's a lot more money than you could be paying somebody in Berlin or in London or in a lot of other places. So you have great quality talent here. It's expensive, so it doesn't exactly translate into filling startup needs. And yeah, I think the other thing is the whole idea of how do you foster a new generation with the right talents, right? A lot of people are trained in a particular profession, and, you know, entrepreneurship is sort of the new liberal arts. You need to have a different set of skills. You need to be quite well-rounded in not just science, but figuring out how do you navigate this entrepreneurial life.
Yeah, it makes me think of a conversation I had with a shoe company founder here.
Oh, cool.
And they founded the company in Zurich, but obviously manufacture in Portugal and Romania.
Yep.
And maybe there's an analogy there for our increasingly international world, where we have some parts of a startup here in Switzerland.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think that's again where you can start to help and structure things. So the association is trying to figure out how can we balance, the sort of things that are possible when you get into this startup world with the practicalities of the way the Swiss culture works. And I think it's already proven to be one of the best frameworks in the world, and that's why you see Switzerland on the top of so many different rankings. And if you look at the things that you need for the digital economy, I think Switzerland is one of the best locations in the world. So we're just figuring out how to bridge the gap right now.
If you have a Swiss banking license or some kind of Swiss FinTech financial license, does that allow you to do cross-border European?
No, that's one of the catches. It would be great if they could figure out an agreement to get banking licenses passported, or the regulation passported. It doesn't happen right now. So you see a lot of companies that will pick like Luxembourg or somewhere like that as their home, or have dual locations to get over that. But yeah, Switzerland offers a lot of times a different type of locations. You might not be going for the same sort of mass retail market where you need a passport across all of Europe. Maybe they're doing more of an international like blockchain business, where being regulated by all of the European regulators isn't really what you want to do. So they play a different game sometimes. Cool. Well, I know you've got to get going. Where can people follow up with you? Are you on Twitter or things like that?
I am on...
What the company website?
Yeah, it's Innovation by Design. And it's Michael Sturtz and I working on this for the New Zealand government.
Great.
You can contact me on... I have a community design house.
Oh, cool.
In San Francisco. You're welcome to come visit. We've birthed a couple of startups there and have a creative community and run some events. Website is bluha.us.
Cool. And the outcome of the trips around the world, the report for New Zealand, is that something that we're going to see more from in the future?
We'll have some synthesized results, which we'll share with you.
And I guess everybody should stay tuned to see what happens in the New Zealand startup community.
Absolutely. Very excited for Wellington and innovation in New Zealand.
Great. Well, thank you, Tom. Been a pleasure. That's the site. Awesome. Well, thank you. Cheers.